Good afternoon. Welcome to everybody here in Brussels and to those joining us from Naples. I'll hand over to Wing Commander Mike Bracken in Naples in a few minutes for the operational update. As you know, the Secretary General visited the headquarters of Operation Unified Protector in Naples on Friday. It was a chance for him to have the very latest update on the progress the mission is making in protecting civilians, and also a chance for him to thank in person all those who are conducting NATO's mission, Operation Unified Protector for Libya. NATO and our partners are carrying out this operation with great care and with great precision, but as we've said from the start, there has to be a political solution to this conflict, and the sooner it comes, the better. On Friday, the Secretary General will take part in the meeting of the contact group in Istanbul. The contact group can make a critical contribution to the search for a political solution, which responds to the legitimate aspirations of the Libyan people. The Secretary General will look to the meeting to come forward with ideas which are realistic and pragmatic. Finally, I have to announce that this will be Mike Bracken's last press conference as the spokesman of Operation Unified Protector. Mike has served this operation tirelessly since he took over as spokesman. His rotation has now reached its planned end, so I would like to thank him for his dedication, for his professionalism, and for the many sleepless nights that he's devoted to answering all your questions. Mike, thank you very much from us in Brussels. Now over to you.
Oana, thank you very much for those kind words. And good afternoon, Brussels, and welcome to those who've joined us here today in Naples. Thank you for joining us once again in our continued effort to keep the public informed of details regarding Operation Unified Protector, the NATO-led mission in Libya under United Nations Security Council Resolution 1970 and 1973. It has only been a few days since our last operational update, so what I thought I would do is provide you with a brief overview of the situation on the ground from east to west, and then recap some of the notable events which have occurred during my tenure as the operational spokesperson and chief media advisor to the OUP commander over the past 2 months plus. Over the past week, NATO forces have flown nearly 1,000 sorties. In the areas of Brega, Misrata and Garion, NATO has degraded the pro-Gaddafi forces and added further protection to the civilian population by removing commander control centres, artillery pieces, rocket launchers, armed vehicles and military refuelling equipment. On Saturday, near Tar Wur Ha, south of Misrata, NATO airstrikes targeted military long-range rocket systems located in a former farm complex, which had been converted into a cache for these systems and a staging post for pro-Gaddafi forces. The rockets were being launched indiscriminately in the areas around Misrata, the city and the port, and the city and locations and villages around the farm itself. NATO is achieving its mission, and its military forces will continue to maintain the pressure on those forces who are planning and carrying out attacks on civilians. Now for the overview of the situation on the ground from east to west. In the east, the situation is relatively stable. Anti-Gaddafi forces are deployed in and around Ojdabia and Jalou, while the pro-Gaddafi forces' stronghold remains Brega. In Misrata, pro-Gaddafi forces have been launching rocket attacks on the city. Indications are that such indiscriminate attacks on civilians are now the only offensive capability available to the pro-Gaddafi forces. Those pro-Gaddafi forces continue to defend the urban areas of Nama and Zlitan, whilst anti-Gaddafi elements are maintaining the pressure from their positions just west of Daphnia. The northwest coastal region is strategically important, with the key oil refinery in Al Zawiya, the main highway connecting Tripoli and Zawara, and the road networks extending south to the Nafusa mountain region. It is assessed that pro-Gaddafi forces retain control of the military infrastructure, cities and highways in this area and are suppressing the local population. There has been a great deal of media coverage of intensified fighting and opposition advances in the Berber Highlands and the Lofusa mountain region. NATO is monitoring the situation there closely, using intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance assets to verify the reports. It is assessed that anti-Gaddafi forces maintain control over the main road between Wazin and Yafran, and also the Shakshur and Al-Kala corridor. Kakla is still contested, and anti-Gaddafi forces are maintaining the pressure in the area. The presence of pro-Gaddafi forces in Garian at this time is probably preventing any uprising in that town, but throughout the western region, pro-Gaddafi forces appear to be largely in defensive positions from which they persist in shelling the civilian population. And now, if I may, I'd like to recap on a few notable events of Operation Unified Protector in the last 2 months. When NATO began its mission in Libya, the operational focus was on removing the widespread and immediate threat to the safety of many thousands of Libyans in the cities of Benghazi, Ajdabia, Brega, Ras Lanuf and Misrata. NATO airstrikes disabled and destroyed those pro-Gaddafi forces actively engaged in harming the population, preventing a massacre in Benghazi and doubtlessly saving many thousands of lives across Libya. As the mission continued to degrade the pro-Gaddafi military, there are a number of occasions which stand out in my mind as particularly significant because they demonstrated the callous recklessness of the pro-Gaddafi forces and their singular determination to come up with alternative ways of harming the Libyan population. Firstly, in the early hours of April the 29th, NATO maritime assets spotted some small, rigid-hull inflatable vessels, known as RIBs, off the coast of Zlitan. They were disturbed in their covert operation to lay mines in the approaches to Misrata port, a clear attempt to endanger shipping and disrupt the delivery of humanitarian aid to the people in the city that was, if you remember, besieged at the time. Just prior to the mining incident, Libyan Foreign Minister Abdullah Ati al-Obidi vowed that regime forces would sink any ship approaching Misrata, essentially threatening NATO patrols and humanitarian aid vessels that were bringing in food and medical supplies and ferrying out refugees and the wounded. Over the coming days and weeks, NATO vessels worked tirelessly to clear the mine danger from Misrata and maintained the safety of shipping entering and leaving the port, which has steadfastly remained open. Then, in the small hours of May the 16th, NATO maritime assets discovered an abandoned RIB, again near Misrata, carrying a ton of high explosives and, bizarrely, 2 human mannequins. It was the first evidence of an attempt by pro-Gaddafi forces to use improvised explosive devices with decoy human mannequins to threaten commercial shipping and humanitarian aid in the area of Misrata. NATO vessels destroyed the RIB and its contents at sea. When NATO saw that pro-Gaddafi forces were now using their maritime assets, it had no choice but to take decisive action to protect the civilian population of Libya and NATO forces at sea. Overnight, on the 19th and 20th of May, a series of precision airstrikes were carried out in Tripoli, Al-Qums and Sirte against the Libyan Navy vessels to ensure their weapon systems could never again be used to inflict harm on civilians. I also recall the question raised at the end of my first press conference on the 13th of May regarding a NATO strike on the primary command and control facility in the Brega region. Following this successful strike on the key command and control node in eastern Libya, NATO watched how pro-Gaddafi forces restructured in Brega, and on the 24th of June, NATO removed the subsequent dispersed command and control centres in and around the city. NATO's intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance provided a clear picture of pro-Gaddafi activity in the ground, and it enabled it to deliver precision-guided strikes with minimum risk to civilians once these military targets were identified and approved. Another milestone in the mission was the introduction of attack helicopters, which were used under NATO command for the first time on June the 4th. As a key force multiplier, attack helicopters had given NATO additional flexibility to track and engage pro-Gaddafi forces deliberately targeting civilians and attempting to hide in built-up areas. They have so far destroyed over 300 military targets, such as armed vehicles, main battle tanks, radar systems, military checkpoints and command posts, and they are assessed to have had a strong deterrent effect on pro-Gaddafi forces launching attacks on civilians. During my operational updates, I've stressed the ongoing necessity for NATO mission to continue its role to protect the civilian population. The operation is and continues to be successful and to fulfill the UN mandate. But sadly, the pro-Gaddafi forces have made it necessary for our mission to continue because they are still determined to launch attacks on the population and continue to use them as a human shield. At an operational update on June the 17th, I played footage of pro-Gaddafi forces using a mosque to launch rockets into a nearby populated area near Zlitan, and NATO's intensification of airstrikes in Tripoli and on the Bab al-Azir presidential complex. These were carried out after meticulous pattern-of-life observations to prevent civilian casualties, after it was seen that a children's playground had been deliberately sited on top of one of Gaddafi's main command and control bunkers in Tripoli. The commander has repeatedly stated that ours is a coordinated campaign plan to apply military pressure across Libya using all assets available to NATO. We have concentrated on dismantling the command and control and logistical support nodes of pro-Gaddafi forces. We have adapted and we've developed our tactics, and we have seen results. Numerous senior civil servants and military commanders have defected from the regime. Morale of the Gaddafi forces has plummeted, and it's clear they are now unable to plan or launch coordinated, sustained attacks across Libya. It is important to note that while NATO has been fulfilling its military mission under the UN mandate, it has also facilitated hundreds of humanitarian aid deliveries into the country to the suffering people of Libya. Humanitarian aid has been critical, and these activities, conducted by air, land and sea, have been encouraged by NATO to enter Libya through places such as Misrata, the Tunisian border and Benghazi. Since OUP began, NATO forces have flown approximately 15,000 sorties, striking and rendering ineffective nearly 3,000 targets, which include command and control centres and other military assets. These have been used by pro-Gaddafi forces to plan and launch attacks on the population. NATO and its partner forces remain fully committed to this mission and are intent on seeing the military mandate through. The NATO forces are determined and dedicated to achieving all the military objectives that have been set. The mission is succeeding. My successor will be Colonel Roland Levoix, who takes over from me as the military spokesperson today. He's currently with the commander, and you will obviously have the opportunity to meet him very soon. That concludes my brief, and I look forward to some of your questions.